Christmas of 1942 at Lilac Hedges in Oceanport, New Jersey, was a subdued affair. Helen Cross confided to her powder blue diary that the tiny tree and sparse decorations reflected a household without Barton. Her hand trembled as she wrote of how the family tried to be cheerful, even as the empty chair at the table mocked their efforts. A few weeks later, in mid-January 1943, Bill Mott received the call about the 5 Sullivan brothers killed together on the USS Juneau. He drafted a memorandum for President Roosevelt, a letter meant to comfort parents in Waterloo, Iowa, who had lost everything. The news hit him hard. His own brother was a prisoner in the Philippines. In January 1943, Red Cross boxes arrived in Davao City, and Barton Cross helped transport them upriver from the Swedish ship Gripsholm. The cigarettes, chocolate, and medicine lifted prisoner morale, but the real gift was proof that the outside world remembered them. When 10 prisoners escaped on April 4th, the Japanese invoked the 10-for-1 rule and sequestered everyone from the escapees' barracks. Barton and Charles Armour spent a month in wire cages crawling with bedbugs and rats, expecting death, until Major Maeda stunned them by announcing a punishment of lost imaginary savings instead of execution. The prisoners returned to the main camp but faced reduced rations and harsher treatment from that day forward. In late May 1943, Bill Mott flew to Pearl Harbor for the Presidential Unit Citation Ceremony aboard the USS Enterprise. He reunited with his brother Benny, the ship's gunnery officer, and together they watched Admiral Nimitz present the award for the carrier's first year of relentless combat. Benny looked exhausted from years of high alert, and the brothers spoke of Barton, still imprisoned somewhere in the Philippines. Standing on the flight deck amid patched-over scars of recent battles, Bill resolved to leave the White House and go to sea. When he told President Roosevelt of his decision, the president said simply that he was reluctant to let him go. Bill replied that the Japanese held his brother, and he felt compelled to fight. In late July 1943, 3 exhausted men stepped off a submarine in Perth, Australia. Stephen Melnick, William Dias, and Melvin McCoy had done what no other American prisoners had managed. They had escaped from the Davao penal colony on Mindanao and survived. Within hours, they received a stern summons from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane. The orders were blunt: proceed to headquarters for debriefing as soon as physically able, and keep your mouths shut. The 3 men were rushed to Brisbane, where they told their story to a room of senior officers and weeping stenographers. They described the Bataan Death March, where tens of thousands of American and Filipino prisoners had been beaten, bayoneted, and shot along a 60-mile stretch of road. They spoke of mass starvation, disease, and daily executions in the prison camps that followed. By August 1943, word of this testimony had reached the highest levels of the Allied command. At the Quadrant Conference in Quebec, General George Marshall rose before the combined chiefs of staff and read William Dias's sworn statement aloud. The room fell silent as Marshall described men buried alive, prisoners shot for falling out of line, and guards making American sergeants beat their own comrades with shovels. The lavish luncheon waiting outside the meeting room went untouched. President Roosevelt, still in Quebec, drafted a reply to a letter from Helen Cross, who had written to him pleading for news of her imprisoned son. He assured her that every effort was being strained to end the war and release the prisoners. Meanwhile, Stephen Melnick had found an ally in Lieutenant Harold Rosenquist, an officer from a secret unit called MISX Together. They developed a plan to rescue the remaining prisoners at Davao, a plan that required submarine transport controlled by Colonel Courtney Whitney at MacArthur's headquarters. And Whitney, for reasons of his own, began to delay. By December 1943, Bill Mott had left the White House and enrolled at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He had finally gotten his wish orders that would take him to sea and into the fight, but the bitter New England winter took a savage toll on a body still recovering from years of desk-bound stress. He collapsed with double pneumonia and was rushed to the Newport Naval Hospital, where doctors placed him inside an oxygen tent. For 3 days, he teetered on the edge of delirium as his fever climbed and plummeted. Inside the rubber enclosure, Bill entertained a feverish reverie, a vision of a successful prisoner rescue mission, of reaching his brother Barton before it was too late. Eleanor Roosevelt called the hospital repeatedly, asking the night nurses for news of Billy Mott, but the phone calls and the dream could not speed his recovery. That same December, far from the hospital wards, William Dias was in California flying practice drills in his P-38 Lightning. The War Department had been sitting on his sworn testimony for months, afraid that releasing the story would derail the Europe First strategy, but Dias never lived to see his story published. On December 22nd, his plane caught fire over the crowded city of Burbank. He could have bailed out safely, but he chose to stay aloft, guiding the burning aircraft toward a vacant lot on Myers Street. The crash killed him on impact, but no civilians on the ground were harmed. The death of the hero of Bataan broke the dam. His father, Judge Richard Dias, and the Chicago Tribune began threatening to have the full story read into the congressional record if the War Department did not release it. On January 28, 1944, after months of suppression and a final flurry of tense meetings in Washington, the story broke. Newspapers across the country carried William Dias's sworn account of the Bataan Death March and the horrors of Japanese prison camps. The front page of the New York Times ran the opening line, a pent-up story of atrocities perpetrated by the Japanese army on the captured heroes of Bataan and Corregidor, was released by the United States government today in sickening detail. The public response was immediate and vengeful. At the christening of the USS Missouri in Brooklyn, Vice President Harry Truman declared, "May this great ship be an avenger to the barbarians who wantonly slaughtered the heroes of Bataan." Helen Cross had been warned. Bill had come to see her in New York weeks earlier, sitting with her and Arthur in their small hotel room, trying to prepare them for what was coming. He had told her that the story would be graphic, that she might be better off not reading it, but she could not look away. On the day the story appeared, she remained in her room with the newspaper, reading and rereading the account, sobbing and lying down until she was weak. That night, she opened her diary and wrote, "A million bayonets pierce my heart, my dear one, my lad of peace and kindliness. Where are you? How fare you, beloved one? I die for you in your pain." The next day, her entry consisted of just 5 words, "Sick, sick in body and mind." By the spring of 1944, Bill Mott had recovered enough from pneumonia to leave the Naval War College and report for his first sea duty. He joined Vice Admiral Richard Kelly Turner, commander of the Pacific Amphibious Force, as flag secretary aboard the flagship USS Rocky Mount. Turner was famous for his volcanic temper, but he recognized Bill's organizational skill and trusted him with the complex planning for the invasion of Saipan. The operation would be the largest amphibious assault yet attempted in the Central Pacific. In late May, the Rocky Mount anchored at Kwajalein alongside the carrier Enterprise. Bill climbed aboard for a brief reunion with his brother Benny. The two men stood together on the flight deck, and Bill studied the exhaustion carved into Benny's face after years of combat. He felt a cold awareness that this might be the last time they would see each other alive. 2 weeks later, the invasion of Saipan began, and the blood-stained stretchers lining the Rocky Mount's passageways became a daily measure of the campaign's cost. On June 6th, the same day the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Japanese began emptying the Deveau-Penel colony. More than 1,200 prisoners were herded onto flatbed trucks, tethered together with rope, and blindfolded for the journey to the coast. Barton Cross was among the first group loaded onto the freighter Yashu Maru. He pushed into the dark hold and wedged himself against the other men packed around him. The suffocating heat and the engine's vibration were the only sensations he could feel as the ship crept northward. Lieutenant Harold Rosenquist finally reached Mindanao on June 15th, dispatched by submarine after months of delay. He trekked through guerrilla-held jungle to the Davao penal colony, only to find it empty. The prisoners had been gone for 10 days. Rosenquist radioed the bitter news to headquarters in Brisbane. Some of the Davao prisoners, after a terrible 3-week voyage, were sent to Cabanatuan Camp on Luzon, their hopes sustained by American air raids overhead. On September 7th, the unmarked Japanese freighter Shinyo Maru sailed from Mindanao carrying 750 American prisoners in its hold. The Navy submarine USS Paddle never received intelligence about the ship's cargo. Torpedoes slammed into the hull, and the explosion tore through the packed compartment, killing hundreds instantly. Japanese guards fired at prisoners who escaped into the water and then abandoned the ship. Survivors who reached the beach were pulled from the surf by Filipino guerrillas and hidden in the jungle. The news of the sinking reached Helen Cross in late September, while she was still recovering from the hurricane that had ravaged the New Jersey coast. She sat at her desk and opened her diary with trembling hands. "I stumble around in a fog, talking to Barton's picture and crying until I am weak," she wrote. At Aiea Heights Naval Hospital in Hawaii, Bill Mott lay in his bed, still weak from bleeding ulcers, when Benny called with the news from Washington. He hung up the phone and felt the last of his hopes drain away. On the morning of September 21st, 1944, Barton Cross and the other prisoners at Cabanatuan were working in the rice fields when they heard a different engine sound. They looked up to see wave after wave of American carrier planes from Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet roaring overhead. In that moment, he felt certain that salvation was close. The prisoners cheered, waved, and some wept. It was the first direct proof that liberation was near. But the Japanese reacted differently. They accelerated plans to ship all able-bodied prisoners to Japan. Within days, the Japanese ordered the camp's senior officer to draw up a list of men fit for travel. Barton Cross was on that list. On October 7th, more than 1,600 prisoners were marched out of Cabanatuan and loaded onto trucks. They were taken to Bilibid Prison in Manila, a staging point for shipment north. The men knew that once they boarded a ship for Japan, their chances of survival would shrink to nearly nothing. On October 10, 1944, 1,803 American prisoners were marched from Bilibid Prison to Manila's Pier 7 and loaded aboard the unmarked freighter Erasan Maru. At the same time, General Douglas MacArthur was preparing to fulfill his famous promise. On October 20th, he waded ashore at Leyte, stood before a Signal Corps microphone, and broadcast to the Philippine people, "I have returned." 4 days later, after returning briefly to Manila Bay for supplies and departing again in a northbound convoy, the Erasan Maru was steaming off the coast of Luzon with its human cargo. Its fate was already sealed. The submarine USS Shark fired 3 torpedoes at the transport. One of them struck the forward hold, where hundreds of men were crammed together. The explosion killed most of them instantly. Japanese guards cut the ladder rope to the forward hold, pounded the rear hatch shut, and abandoned ship in lifeboats. Some prisoners managed to stack corpses, climb out, and leap into the sea. Japanese destroyer crews refused to take them aboard, and some survivors were shot in the water. After 2 days, 9 men were still alive. 4 were recaptured by the Japanese, but the remaining 5 were rescued by a Chinese fishing junk. By December 1944, survivors of both the Shinyo Maru and the Erasan Maru had been flown to Washington for debriefing. Benny Mott, stationed at the Navy Department, arranged to meet 3 of them: John Moret, Calvin Grafe, and George Petritz. Petritz, a fellow ensign who had been at Davao with Barton, could give Benny concrete news. He told Benny that Barton was alive and well when he left Cabanatuan in early October. But Petritz had been transferred to another ship that was sunk in Subic Bay. He escaped and reached the Leyte beachhead. He knew nothing of Barton's fate after the Cabanatuan evacuation. Moret and Grafe added their own accounts. They had seen Barton at Davao, had traveled with him on the Yashu Maru, and had been separated only when the prisoners were sent to different details. Benny listened to each survivor's account, his hands folded in his lap. He forced himself to ask the question he dreaded: did anyone know where Barton was? All 3 survivors confirmed that Barton had endured 3 years of captivity with resilience and humor, but none knew if he had been aboard the Erasan Maru. His name was not on any survivor list. Benny left the meeting with the same gnawing uncertainty his family had lived with for years. The story of Barton Cross is the story of thousands of Americans who vanished into the Japanese prison system during the Second World War. For every survivor who came home, there were dozens whose fate remains unknown, their names carved into marble walls, their final days unrecorded. Charles Armour survived the war and returned to his native Arkansas, though he and Barton Cross never met again. Harold Rosenquist continued his intelligence work after the war, always haunted by the prisoners he had been unable to save. Stephen Melnick returned to the Pacific to serve on MacArthur's staff, coordinating guerrilla intelligence for the liberation of the Philippines. William Dias's sworn statement, published after his death, forever changed the American public's understanding of the Pacific War and galvanized the liberation effort. The Mott family eventually learned that Barton Cross had been killed aboard the Arisan Maru. Helen Cross kept her powder blue diary until her last days. Bill Mott returned to the Pacific and served with distinction, but he never spoke of his brother without a pause. The loss was a wound that never fully healed. If you have your own family stories from the Pacific War or memories of a relative who served in that theater, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments below. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our work on these historical documentaries. Thank you for listening.